I created a backdrop using the wet on wet oil painting technique made popular by Bob Ross. And here's a picture of my Owensville Terminal Micro where you can see the autumn scene in the backdrop. And I'm going to show you how I did it here in this video. I'm using 1/8 inch hardboard or Masonite panel, and I need to prime it first before I put oil paints on it. I like to use 3 coats of primer. This is a Liquitech Basic I found at my local Hobby Lobby. Very inexpensive, very durable, very good to use. And I use a foam brush to apply it. Pretty simple. After each coat, let it dry. Do a light sand. I use a foam sanding block to sand it between each layer. And usually 3 coats will cover up so you don't see any of the brown of the hardboard coming through. All right, my board is primed. I've also marked a line, like a horizon line. It really doesn't serve as a horizon line. It's just where the baseboard comes up to the back of the backdrop. Everything below that line won't be visible. So I'm not going to worry about painting it, but I want to make sure I paint just below it so that I don't get any of that white showing through. And you make sure that this gesso is completely dry before you start putting oil paints. Now, when I start doing the oil paints, you don't wait for those to dry because it's wet on wet or alla prima. You're going to go ahead and apply wet paint to wet paint. And so let's get started with that process. I'm using this liquid white in this 1 inch brush to apply a base coat. And the trick to this is get it real thin. And I'm going to paint the entire board with this liquid white. And I'm going to load my brush by tapping it onto my palette into that liquid white. And this is a very thin paint. It's real easy to get too much, so I always recommend taking a little off on a napkin first. And if you don't have enough, you can always add more, but it's a lot harder to take it off if you get too much. If you get it too heavy and it's too runny, it'll actually make the paint run. And so less is more on this. And I like to work it in using horizontal and vertical strokes, even diagonal strokes, but make sure that when you are finished, end with a horizontal stroke just to blend everything out. And if you need to add more paint, just tap. It's hard to see because the paint is white. Of course, the backdrop is white. I'll speed it up here a little bit to see how I do this here. I'm just going to keep doing this until I get a nice coat on here. And I'll take my finger, touch it on here, and see just a light coat. You can see it there. I could take my brush and take that fingerprint out, but we're going to cover it up with paint. I'm using the phthalo blue, and I'm going to start with the sky. Pretty basic, pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and use the same brush that I applied the liquid white. You can see it on the bristles here. And I'm going to go ahead and tap into the blue paint. I recommend using that little knife to smear out the paint. And it's real easy to get too much, just like the liquid white. I always wipe it off. See how you get that little dark concentration there? When I first started this method, I used to always glob that on, and I find it's easier to wipe it off. And even as I do it here, I'm going to use crisscross strokes to paint this. And you're going to notice I get a couple of little clumps there. The good thing is the liquid white on the backdrop will allow me to smooth that out. And I can blend that out just using these crisscross strokes. I'm doing this rather quickly, but I am using a crisscross method. This is the best way. You could do circular, but I find the crisscross works better. And as I paint this, I try to kind of leave gaps, to represent clouds. And this is all going to get blended out. And if the brush starts to run out a little bit, I'll just tap the bristles and add a little bit more to it. Again, less is more, so I always recommend making sure that you have less paint than more paint, because the phthalo blue will really swallow up this background if you're not careful. and just continue to work back and forth, taking longer to show you this. Now you notice I'm going down below that line. I'll just call it for horizon line just for clarity, but that's actually where the baseboard meets the backdrop. Everything below that is not going to be visible, so I'm not going to waste paint on it. Now I'm going to take this 1.5 inch blender. This 1.5 inch blender is actually, I believe it's goat hair. I got this at a local Hobby Lobby. It's very soft, and I like to use this in a circular motion to blend out the sky. And what it's going to do, the phthalo blue is a thicker paint. And as I do this, it's going to mix with that liquid white that's on the backdrop. And it's going to begin to blend it out and actually soften. And you notice how these little white areas I left open are looking more like clouds. And I have left a big gap here, so let me add a little more paint. Let me fill that in just a little bit. Most of this is going to be covered up with trees, so you're not going to see a lot of it. So it doesn't really matter to have a lot of detail in this point. All right, I'm going to use that blender again. And you can use crisscross strokes, but I like the circular strokes better for this. And then as I do that, I want to go horizontal again, and that's just to get the brush marks out. And you can soften this up to whatever level you want. The nice thing about this is if you just want a blue sky, when I get finished at this point, you could go with this, and this works great for model railroad backdrops. You don't necessarily have to do this next step, but I'm going to show you how I do that here. I'm going to add some clouds, and I'm going to use this little fan brush here. I believe it's a number 3 fan brush. There's 2 different sizes, and I'm going to use this titanium white. Now this is the tube paint, not the liquid white. And this is a thicker, drier paint. It's actually quite dry. But this is going to help us be able to get some cloud effects. And I just kind of wiggle it back and forth, turning both sides over to load it. You can even tap it a little bit. And I'm just going to use the corner of the brush, and I'm going to move around, and no real rhyme or reason. I kind of follow the white patterns I have up in the sky. But for the most part, you just want to put in some cloud shape. Here's a little trick. When doing this, keep the brush moving. One of the things I do, even if it looks like I'm lingering in an area, the brush is actually moving. And if I begin to run low on paint, I can actually flip it to the other corner and get a little bit more. You can do this to whatever level you want. And if your paint gets to run out on both sides, just load it up again. And again, using that little circular motion, using just the corner of the fan brush. And I'll add a bunch more clouds in here just for clarity and just to show you how I do it. And then a little bit later, I'll take that blender brush, that 1.5 inch goat hair brush, and blend these out again. One of the nice things about the sky is this allows you a lot of practice. So if you're doing this for the first time, don't be afraid to put a lot of clouds in. It's good practice. If you're a little nervous about doing a backdrop like this, I suggest getting a inexpensive canvas and practice on a canvas. You can even do this on a piece of scrap Masonite and prime it and practice doing the technique. Now I'm going to speed this up just for the sake of time, and you can see how I'm continuing this process. I'm going to go back and take this blender brush, this 1.5 inch, using that same circular motion, and I'm just going to blend out the brush marks. And I'll use the corner and use that circular motion. Sometimes when I'm painting, I get going fast, and it's sometimes hard to see exactly what I'm doing. Not to mention the cast shadow from my hand, as well as getting my hand in the way. But this is pretty simple. I also like to recommend, too, that you can find a lot of Bob Ross videos available on free streaming services such like Tubi, Freevee, and Pluto TV. And I think all of the shows in his series are there. So that's a great way to learn how to use this technique. And again, speed up the process. I don't paint that fast. And now I'll take the brush, and with a light touch, I'm just going to fluff the clouds up. just kind of using an upward motion, and then I'll finish with a horizontal motion, just again to make sure I get all the brush strokes out. I'm going to use a mixture of alizarin crimson and sap green. And if you mix these two together, you're going to get a nice brown color. I like to start with the alizarin crimson. This gets me to a more red shade of brown. So I like to start with the color, the primary color, in this case the red, and then I'll add it into the green. Proportionately, it will be more red than green. And I always find if you start with the color you want, such as a red shade, it works a lot better. And all I'm doing with the knife is just picking the paint up off the palette. And this is just a clear acrylic palette I got at Hobby Lobby, fairly inexpensive. And I just continue to mix it till I get a nice blend, and that's a nice brown color. You want to test your color, you can always put a little bit of titanium white in it to see what it is, and then blend up a little bit more of the dark colors. I'm going to use this 1-inch brush, and I'm going to use the excess paint on the knife and just scrape it off. Now, I actually teach painting workshops, so I have a lot of these brushes. If you have just a single brush, you'll have to clean it every time you change colors. So if you can afford it, and these aren't cheap, they're not expensive, but they're not cheap, I recommend getting 2 of these brushes. It saves on having to clean. And I'm just going to load the bristles, and I'm actually going to pull the paint on both sides, and it's going to cause the bristles to round off. See how it's kind of rounded off there? And that's going to allow me, as I take the corner of the brush, and I'm going to work from the bottom up. And I'm doing this because the darker paint will be at the bottom, but as I work up, it'll get lighter. And I'm creating the actual foliage and bush shadows. And this dark color is going to help to show the light color. Bob Ross always used to say you need dark to show light, and that's important. So as you do this, and because this is a tapping motion, the palette or the easel will move. And I'm just holding it there, just keep things steady. But as I tap, I'm just using the corner of the brush, and I'm not allowing the brush to slide. And as the paint begins to run out, I get these light, kind of feathery foliage shapes, and that's what you want. You need dark to show light, but the lighter the foliage is, it looks like distant trees. I'm going to speed this up just for the sake of time. And as I work this out, when I load paint, I start from the bottom and I work up. That keeps my darker colors at the bottom. And this underpainting is really just the shadows. I'm going to take that script liner brush and I'm going to paint some tree trunks. And I just go into my odorless paint thinner. I recommend odorless paint thinner over turpentine and other solvents because it doesn't have as strong a smell. It says odorless, but believe me, odorless paint thinner has an odor. I recommend using this in a well-ventilated room because it is toxic. So be careful when you use it. But it's certainly not as bad as turpentine. Ooh, that stuff smells. And I'm going to thin this out with the paint thinner to an ink-like consistency. And I'll roll my brush in it. And then I'm going to take this, holding the brush at the back end, and just do a lifting motion to put in some tree trunks. If the paint doesn't stick, it means your paint's too thick. So add a little more paint thinner. And a key rule to this, one of the things Bob Ross always used to say is a thin paint will stick to a thick paint. And that's one of the keys to this wet on wet painting technique. I highly recommend practicing this first, especially if this is your first time on a scrap piece of Masonite that's been primed. There is a touch to this. It's not difficult, but practice makes perfect. And as you come up on the tree, as you go up higher, I always recommend a lighter touch. And I sort of have a nervous twitch when I paint, and sometimes I'll get a thicker tree top than the bottom. but no problems. Practice makes perfect on this. I'm going to go back in and load that 1-inch brush, and I'm going to put in some dark color again, and I'm just going to tap in at the base of the trunks just to kind of blend everything in and set everything back. And then as the paint begins to run out, I'm actually going to go up to these upper portions of the tree and put those foliage shadows in. In a little bit, I'm going to add the autumn highlights to it. And do this to whatever desire, but don't just do this at random. Think of the shapes of the tree foliage. Don't think individual leaves. Think the shape of foliage. Cadmium yellow. I'm going to use bright red. And I'm going to use this yellow ochre to create the autumn shades of the trees. I'm going to use a 1-inch brush. I've cleaned it. And I'm going to load the brush just like I did the others. And here's my palette. And here's the mixes I have. This first one is just the bright red and the cad yellow. It's an orange color. This is the yellow ochre and the cadmium yellow. It gives me a gold color. And then I use the bright red and the yellow ochre. It gives me more of this darker orange color. And I'm going to load the brush just like I did for the dark foliage. And I'm going to round the edges. And because I have multiple brushes, this is going to make it a lot quicker for me. But as I put this orange color on, and again the bright red and the cadmium yellow, I'm just going to continue to load. And if I'm having trouble getting it to stick, I can add just a touch of paint there. But boy, just a touch. I didn't do this in this painting. I just continued to load the brush, and my paint was thin enough that it was sticking. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. And I'm just going to do some of this color in different areas, not only the tree foliage, but some bushes down at the ground. I'm going to switch to a clean brush, and I'm going to load up the next color. And again, if you only have one brush, you got to clean it each time. But because I have multiple brushes, I'm going to use a brush for each color. This is that gold color. That's the yellow ochre and the cad yellow. And I'll just vary up the color shades with some gold. Another brush, and let's go into that darker red shade, rounding the brush just like I did earlier. And I'll tap over here and do this for these other trees. And I'm going to work back and forth with all the colors that I have. I'm going to go ahead and speed things up, but it's, again, the same motion. And I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to mention it now. When you do this, be sure that your brush doesn't slide. Do a tap, but don't allow the brush, don't press so hard that it causes the brush to slide. That just makes everything muddy, and you won't like the look at all. And again, just working back and forth. And because this is a model railroad backdrop, I don't need a lot of fancy detail. I'm not painting a painting masterpiece. I just want something to represent autumn trees. I'm going to take a little of that liquid white. The paint's having a little trouble sticking, but that liquid white, just a little bit, will brighten those colors and also help ease application. And I'm just going to brighten up the foliage a little bit. Now, if you get it a little too light, you can go back in with your dark paint, that brown color we made earlier, and just add it in, and you can darken it up. I'm darkening it up down by the horizon. And then I can come back over it with the various autumn colors and fill it in. I'm going to take the knife, and I'm going to use just the tip, and I'm going to scrape out some little weeds, saplings, and small trunks. And as it scrapes, and I apply enough pressure, I'm actually scraping all the paint away back down to the white. Gives it almost like a birch-like effect. You can do this at whatever level you want. And if you get it a little too heavy, you can come back with your brush and actually add some of the foliage highlights again, or come back in the dark if you're getting a little light. And I'm doing that here just to show you how to do it. But anywhere it looks a little too bright. I'm not wanting anything fancy here. I just want to create a colorful backdrop because my trains are going to be the main stars of this. All right, I don't really like the look of that foliage there. So if you see something you don't really like, you can always come back and touch it up. Careful though, it's real easy to overwork this. Do it to whatever level you like. And when you're satisfied, go ahead and stop. As you can see, I keep going. But it is quite simple. And I'm going to go back in with that script liner brush, and I'm going to use that dark brown color just to put in a few twigs and sticks and some trunks and things like that here, to whatever level you want. Most of this is going to be down towards the horizon by the baseboard, and you're not going to see a lot of this anyway. This painting technique is fairly simple. Practice does help, but even a first-time painter can have good results. So I encourage you to give it a try if you'd like to try it out. You really can make some striking backdrops, and a whole lot cheaper than having to buy them. All right. And I think that's going to pretty much do it. All right, there it is. It's all ready, and it's going to take about 7 to 10 days to dry. And when it is, you can put it up on your baseboard, and you got yourself a colorful backdrop. Thank you for watching. If you have a question, feel free to leave it in the comment section of this video, or go to www.bobross.com and learn more about the wet-on-wet oil painting technique at the Bob Ross site.